If ever there were an unexpected election victory, Saturday's win to Australia's Conservative Liberal National Coalition was it. The coalition had lost 56 news polls in a row, every single one of them since August 2016, bearing in mind the last election was in July 2016. Scott Morrison had been PM for roughly 5 minutes, actually since late August last year, after taking power in a messy palace coup. Labor had a detailed worked-through manifesto that put addressing climate change, an issue Australians had told pollsters that they cared about, front and centre. The election, it seemed, was Labor's for the taking until it wasn't. Australia's pollsters, for the first time, were wrong, and that's a story in itself. Climate change turned out to matter rather less than everyone thought, especially when stacked up against national wealth. For those on the political right, including US President Donald Trump, who fired off an ecstatic tweet, witnessing the Australian election result was to no true joy, sort of like seeing Jeremy Clarkson get his Aston Martin clamped. In today's podcast, I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, I'll tell you a bit about Australian politics and the way the political system works. Otherwise, nothing else I say will make any sense. Next, I'll deal with why I think climate change failed to resonate as an election issue. And finally, I'll talk about how and why Australia's pollsters managed to get their forecasts so very, very wrong. Donald Trump has even likened the win to his own victory in 2016. I'll ask whether he was right to do so. First of all, Ozpoll for dummies. You'll get used to #Ozpoll. That's what it is on Twitter. It's one of the liveliest and most argumentative hashtags on Twitter. Australia is a peculiar country. Similarities to the UK are more apparent than real, something Brexit has thrown into sharp relief. Australians look on in bemusement when seeing Britain's civil service, the Tories and Labour trip over each other and fall hilariously down separate flights of stairs. Australia, by contrast to the UK and to the United States, is orderly, prosperous and well governed. It came through the 2008 global financial crisis unscathed. It has the highest minimum wage and lowest unemployment in the OECD. Alone among Western liberal democracies, it has few populists of either left or right, despite admitting vast numbers of immigrants. Over a quarter of Australians were born abroad, double the number in the US or France. It has enjoyed 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Younger Australians have no direct experience of recession, and even middle-aged Australians only remember one with clarity, and that was back in 1991. The oddness, or Australia's oddness, stems from the country's political system, which is like that of no other nation. It has compulsory voting enforced rigorously, Saturday elections, which are like carnival or party. You typically go to the polling place, or the polling booth as it's often called, and buy food and drink there. This is all done as a vehicle for local schools and community groups and sporting groups to raise money, which they do very successfully. It has a written constitution, much like the United States, but that constitution can only be altered by referendum requiring a majority of the electors in a majority of the states. So the 3 big states, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, can vote for something and massively outnumber the 3 little states, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia, and still lose. It's a protection for federalism and for the distinctiveness of each state's particular identity, and the states are quite different with very different histories. Its House of Representatives, despite being elected using instant runoff, or what locals call compulsory preferential, that means you have to number all of the boxes in order to the last box, so that means your vote will exhaust, to use the expression. It isn't hugely different from the Commons because it's based on constituencies, and marginal seats determine which leader commands a majority, which is much the case as in the UK. The Senate, however, could not be more different from the House of Lords. The Senate has the power to reject all bills, including budget and appropriation bills, initiated by the government in the House. It can initiate its own legislation, all forms of legislation with the exception of money bills. It's elected differently from the House using what's known as single transferable vote, or the Hare-Clark system, which is a blend of preferential voting and proportional representation. you need about 14% to get a quota. But that 14% doesn't all have to be from number one votes or what Australians call primary votes. It can also be got from preferences. This unusual system was modified to suit local conditions by a woman called Catherine Spence, who is generally recognised to be Australia's greatest electoral systems reformer. Australians produce the world's best election nerds because we have such an unusual voting system, and Catherine Spence is so admired she appears on the $5 note, which tells you something about Australians, I think. The proportional aspect of the Senate inevitably gives rise to a crossbench of one or more senators from minor parties. These minor parties will be unrepresented in the House, and you'll have heard of one of them because she has created a global phenomenon and controversy all around the place, and that is Pauline Hanson. But she isn't the only person from One Nation in the Senate. There are other senators from other states in One Nation who have been elected to the Senate. She is just the leader of them. So the Australian system is a distinctive hybrid of Westminster and US bicameralism. Sometimes people will jokingly refer to it as a Washminster system because of the way the Australian system blends bits from the United Kingdom and the United States. But the key thing to remember with the structure of the Parliament is that we have two houses, alike in dignity and power, in chilly Canberra, the capital, where we lay our scene. The Liberals and the Nationals, commonly called the Coalition, have existed under various names since 1923. From the first, they appealed to well-heeled business people, wealthy farmers, professionals, Protestants. Over time, they broadened their catchment to include prosperous tradesmen and small farmers, and as with the Conservatives in the UK, Australia's Coalition is the country's natural party of government. Labor has long been the principal party of the left and has deep roots. The first Labor government elected anywhere on the planet was elected in Queensland, and you'll hear more about Queensland in this podcast, in 1899. And that was before Australia had even federated into a single nation. At that point, in 1899, the states were all separate colonies. That gives you an idea of the framework of the Australian system. It's very brief. If you're more interested, you should do some more research. It is a very, very peculiar system. It is like nothing else you've ever seen, and it's why it produces very distinctive politics. Now, the election was fought on a number of issues, and one of the things that Labor did going into the campaign was come up with a big picture plan, a big picture manifesto for the election. But there were two big issues involved, and one was a focus on climate change, and the other one was a willingness to go into an election campaign on a platform that included increased taxes. Now, I'm going to talk about the climate change aspect because the tax aspect requires detailed knowledge of the way Australia taxes investments, particularly the income, the dividends that you get from shares. About the only thing I will say about the franking credits issue here is that it is very difficult to win on a platform of increased taxes in any country. Australia is no particular exception to that, and there is a serious argument to be made that no one has ever won an election in Australian history going into the campaign on a platform of increased taxes. Now, you can quibble around the edges of that historical argument, but it was a big set-piece part of Labor's manifesto, and there's a pretty good case to be made that it really did help to shoot Bill Shorten and the Labor Party in the foot in the campaign. Now, why did climate change not resonate? I'm going to make a few sort of broader points here about the problem with trying to make climate change fly as a political issue in Australia, despite the fact that people will persistently tell pollsters, although as we now know in this election the pollsters got it wrong, but Australians persistently tell pollsters that they care about climate change. And yet when the rubber hits the road, nothing happens, and this election was a classic example of that. So from my perspective, this is why I don't think it works. Broadly speaking, I find the obsession of the Australian left with climate change as a political issue with which to fight elections to be really odd. Australia is a small, largely post-industrial economy, and climate change is a global issue. In terms of our domestic economy, there simply isn't anything an Australian government can do that will have a significant impact on climate change. However, Australia is extremely rich because it sells dirty stuff like coal to China and India and other countries that do contribute to climate change in a big way. Australia could stop selling coal to them, but this wouldn't change anything either. They would just buy coal from someone else, or perhaps exploit domestic resources. China is understood to have a reasonably decent coal reserves. This would also ruin Australia's economy and undermine what is jokingly referred to as quarry australis, which is a phenomenon whereby if you dig a hole in Australia, you make money. The country is enormously wealthy, has enormous mineral wealth. So almost anything an Australian government tries to do or seeks to do on climate change is essentially just empty signalling. If you frame the election as empty signalling versus national wealth, I think what happened in Queensland, where the election was really decided, the lesson is that people will choose national wealth every time and good jobs. This is not really a surprise. Now, what happened in the election and in the lead up to the election over a number of years, going back, I remember this being an issue when I was working for Senator Lionhelm in Canberra between 2014 and 2016. There was a proposal, or is a proposal, by a big Indian company called Adani to excavate a large open-cut coal mine in Carmichael coal mine in the Galilee Basin in the middle of Queensland. Queensland is one of 2 states that has the bulk of the country's enormous mineral wealth. And I mean, it is literally quarry australis. You can dig holes in it and you can get coal, you can get oil, you can get gas, you can get uranium, you can get diamonds, you can get gold. It's a very wealthy country in terms of mineral wealth. It has what economists call huge factor endowments. It's why Australia is wealthier per head of population, much wealthier per head of population than neighbouring New Zealand, even though New Zealand is arguably a much better run country, simply because New Zealand doesn't have the factor endowments. It's got pretty countryside and The Lord of the Rings was filmed there and so on and so forth, but it doesn't have the mineral wealth. So the Adani mine has been controversial for a number of years, and there's been repeated attempts to stop it being built and to stop the approvals going through. There's been litigation. There's been native title litigation by Indigenous people to stop it going ahead. There's been litigation on conservation grounds. It has also failed to achieve funding in a number of funding rounds. There's been all sorts of issues and fights over Adani, and it probably doesn't hurt you to not know any more than that. That's all you really need to know. But going into the campaign, Labor, supposedly the Australian political party of the worker, was very equivocal about Adani, and the smaller, more left-wing or more environmentalist left-wing, in some ways they're more right-wing than Labor, particularly when it can come to areas of tax policy, the Greens really made a big song and dance about stopping Adani, stopping the mine. And Labor was very equivocal because Labor has been trying to deal with the fact that the Greens have been stealing their more environmentally conscious vote over a number of years. So the Labor Party was placed in a very, very difficult position by the Adani mine, by the policies of the Greens, and then by the policies of the coalition being very in favour of the Adani mine in the lead up to the election. And in any case, what happened is that the electorate in Queensland, particularly in the geographical areas where people were likely to be employed by this mine, so you get the area of central Queensland, Capricornia, which is where I used to practice law there. There's a city in central Queensland called Rockhampton, which has traditionally been a very safe Labor area and has always produced many Labor MPs at the state and federal level. And needless to say, in Rockhampton, in Mackay, in the Galilee Basin and in the Bowen Basin, the Labor vote collapsed last Saturday, and the Labor lost all its regional and rural seats except for one, which happened to be the one that was not affected by the proposed mining development, the Adani mine. And Labor's primary vote, which is what Australians call the number one vote on the ballot paper, so the primary vote, which determines how much electoral funding you get and quite a lot of other things, collapsed to 27%. And in a system like Australia, which has preferential voting, a form of the alternative vote, it becomes very, very difficult to win any seats when your number one votes, the number of people who want to put you one on the ballot paper, has collapsed to less than a third. So this happened across Queensland. The other states were more equivocal, and Victoria, there was actually a swing to Labor, but the Queensland vote was so devastating that it undermined Labor's position completely and really pretty much decided the fate of the election. It probably helps you to know that, I'm from Queensland originally, that Queensland is historically one of the two most conservative states. The other one is Western Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, has always had significant mining, agriculture and mining developments based on the mineral wealth that is present under the soil in Queensland. Now, personally, I have to admit I was expecting a Labor victory, mainly because I thought the coalition would be thrown out due to 6 years of leadership instability and infighting, and that Labor was also the best chance of Australia returning to some sort of prime ministerial stability. I've included a link under this video to a feature I wrote for Standpoint magazine on how Australia became what I call Italy with crocodiles. Despite all that wealth and stability and all those long years of economic growth, Australia has gone through 5 prime ministers, 6 if you count Kevin Rudd twice, in 8 years. Perhaps the fact that the most recent Labor governments were just as bad as the coalition in terms of infighting caused voters to discount this somewhat, I don't really know. But you will notice in that Standpoint piece, I project in the last couple of paragraphs that Labor will win the election. It's only 1 or 2 sentences, but I, like everybody else who paid attention to Australian polling, thought that Labor would win the election. And in some respects, I have less excuse than many other people who are following the election, even people who still live in Australia, which I don't, because I am native to Queensland and I am aware of Queensland's very peculiar politics. And I admit I didn't pay enough attention to Queensland during the election campaign. Now I turn to the third issue, to the polling issues, and why Australia's pollsters got their forecasting so wrong. You might be wondering, why does this matter? Pollsters are always wrong in other countries. They've become a bit of a laughingstock after Donald Trump and Brexit. Well, this is where Australia does have a very particular story to tell. Pollsters in other countries are confronted, when they do polling, by 3 existential questions. Are the people that they're asking questions of going to even vote? Do those people who are being questioned form part of a representative sample? And are those people telling the truth about their voting intention? Now, in Australia, pollsters only have to worry about 2 of these. Number 2, do they form part of a representative sample? And number 3, are they telling the truth about their voting intentions? They don't have to worry about number 1 because voting is compulsory. If you call someone on the telephone and ask them how they're going to vote and they tell you, you know that that will happen because of compulsory voting. Australia has enormously high turnouts. You will be fined if you don't vote in Australia, and it's also seen as a great civic party, in a sense. Australian elections are beautiful things to experience. Foreign people who come to Australia and who see the elections, the Saturday elections, where they're like carnival, with all the food and drink and the stalls and the democracy sausage and so on and so forth. They're always stunned by the quality of Australia's civic participation. So the idea that people wouldn't vote is really, really quite staggering. Compulsory voting means in Australia that there is one less thing in statistical terms that pollsters have to control for. And what this has meant over the years is that polling in Australia has been very, very accurate. In the last election, when I was in Australia and I was running Senator Lion Helm's election campaign to be re-elected, and he was re-elected, I felt I could trust all the polls, and the polls turned out to be accurate. What that means, though, is that Australian pollsters and commentators, in which I include myself, have become very lazy. Polling companies, it's now become clear since Saturday, have not updated their sampling methods, and one of the things that this has generated is that politically engaged people in the cities have been oversampled. This is one of the reasons why the Queensland result was not foreseen. Now, when politically engaged people in the cities are oversampled, and one poll after another seems to be showing the same result, you get a phenomenon known as herding, which is basically where all the different polling companies follow each other off a cliff. No one wants to be that guy. No one wants to be the outsider poll or the outlier poll. So they all finish up following each other and tweaking the figures and inserting noise into the data, which already isn't very good because of the problems with sampling errors. And they just become more and more wrong. There are other things going on here as well. Since 2015, they've employed robocalls instead of real operators. And we now know, and Anthony Green, who's Australia's leading psephologist, has talked about extensively the extent to which people simply hang up on automated polls. The pollsters don't have access to what is known as the Integrated Public Number Database, which contains all listed and unlisted numbers in the country, including mobile numbers, and it's used by emergency services and law enforcement. Now, the polling companies have been desperately pleading with governments at the state and the federal level of all stripes to please change this, because they have been aware that eventually they were going to start producing sampling errors as a result of not having access to a full bank of telephone numbers. Finally, another reason why polling could be inaccurate is a phenomenon, and it was first discovered in the United Kingdom, so it's got a British name, known as shy Tories. And it's commoner on the political right, and in fact there's a pretty serious case to be made that it now only exists on the political right. It was first noticed in 1992 in the UK when John Major led the Conservatives to a wholly unexpected election victory. Polling UK finished up with egg all over their faces. It was very embarrassing. Now, shy Tories requires certain things to be in place beforehand for it to happen. It emerges when people are afraid to admit that they're right-wing to a pollster, and it probably also is enhanced when you have robocalls, because people have no compunction about lying to a computer. And I admit, because I have in the past relied on polling data in order to do work, both for the politician I worked for and also to write commentary for newspapers and magazines, I wasn't hugely happy about this. I thought it wasn't great at all. But lots of people do it. They think it's funny, and it's much easier to do it to a computer. Most people feel a bit funny about lying to a real person. People are more inclined to lie to pollsters, whether real people or computers, if they're right-wing, because to be left has been, since the early 90s, to be construed as more moral. Now, this isn't just a function of the terrible abuse you see from left-wing people on social media, and you've got to be very careful if you spend a lot of time on social media if you think that everybody who's right-wing has that same experience. You only have that experience if you're on social media, and particularly if you're on Twitter. If you're right-wing and you're never on Twitter, then you don't see that, but you might see it in other contexts. And I do think there has been one issue that bubbled along for the whole time that the election campaign was on in Australia that did contribute to a shy Tory effect in this election, and that concerned the situation of rugby player Israel Folau. Now, Israel Folau is Australia's best rugby player, and like many people of Pacific Islander descent, and I have some Pacific Islander relatives myself, so I speak from a degree of experience here. Pacific Islanders are conservative Christians. They tend to have the same moral views, except they are wholly monogamous, of course, as many Muslims. So they're opposed to homosexuality, they're opposed to sex before marriage. They're often Pentecostal Christians, and when they're not Pentecostal, they can be, for example, Methodist or Presbyterian and quite conservative. Now, they've historically tended to vote Labor, because Labor has always been the party of anti-racism. Pacific Islanders are brown. They're not black, they're brown people. And if you've ever looked at the New Zealand All Blacks, who are the best rugby team in the world, bar none, the Maori, who form the majority of the All Blacks, they are a variety of Pacific Islander. There are a lot. And one of the things that happened was the constant controversy of Israel Folau, who put a homophobic statement about gays going to hell on his Instagram. And after a long and protracted and ugly and drawn-out process, finished up having his contract terminated by Rugby Australia. And I must admit, I'd seen New Zealanders and English people and Welsh people all saying things along the lines of, oh, way to get rid of your best player, Australia, you stupid idiots, and what's this got to do with his ability to play rugby? But this enormously long and drawn-out process happened at exactly the same time as the election campaign, and it told a significant ethnic minority who tend to be geographically concentrated in Australia, Pacific Islanders, that the Labor Party, which has been the party of gay rights, LGBT rights more broadly, no longer had their back. So the fact that Labor was historically the party of anti-racism was cancelled out to a very large degree by the fact that Labor had become the party of LGBT rights. And so the Pacific Islanders, and it's become very clear from the electorates where there were large numbers of Pacific Islanders, voted for the coalition. But they may well have, and I don't know whether this has been established yet, but it will not surprise me if it does become established, strikes me that the core of that shy Tory vote in Australia will be among Pacific Islanders, and there are many, many Pacific Islanders in Australia. These are people who would traditionally vote Labor, and they haven't this time. And Labor has lost seats where there are large numbers of them. Not many seats, only 2 or 3, but the margin was narrow, and that's all you need to do in a close election, and this was a close election. Donald Trump was expectorating, as he does, on his favourite toilet wall, otherwise known as Twitter, about how this was an election that was a bit like his election in 2016. And on one level, he's right when it comes to the shy Tory phenomenon and Pacific Islanders, but on another level, he's not. The Australian centre-right coalition is actually to the left of the US Democrats. People tend not to appreciate how different politics is in Australia from that in the United States. Ultimately, Australia has gone for safety and security and for economic management, as well as rejecting the idea that they have to pay lots of money for climate change, rather than electing some sort of populist. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, is not any sort of populist. He's a pragmatic, middle-of-the-road, fairly moderate centre-right Prime Minister.